Welcome to the Citizens Reporter. I'm the host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is a weekly cable cast news program coming to you out of Valley Access Studios in Stillwater. Now this week, to help me with this week's news is one of my regular citizen reporters, Mr. Mark Bradley. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I do have not as many articles as usual because it seems that our press is getting smaller and smaller. We have a couple of articles that came out this week. One happens to talk about what's happening to, and this happens to be a good school that actually is going to be closing very soon. And why I say it's a good school, my son went to it, and he has a very good job right now, and that was because there was a Minneapolis business school that actually was out of Roseville. It wasn't any longer in Minneapolis, but it's existed for 145 years and was considered to be superior in placement. So quite a few companies did hire on it, but because of people weren't aware of it, it just was not getting the applicants it used to get. And I have so few students that are continuing, they feel it's about time to shut down. But that's the article, and that's the school that my son went to, so I'm very aware of it. He's holding a very good job, and I thought the school did a good job with him, so it's nothing as a problem in this case.
Right. Well, and we've heard a lot about problem for-profit higher institutions. And this school was a for-profit school, but as you indicated, they were not involved in any of the various scandals like Globe College or a number of other for-profit institutions. And it does say, though, that they had declining numbers and that they were founded in 1874. I mean, when you think about, it's easy to say 145 years. But when you start thinking, okay, what does that mean? Well, that's 1874. That's a very long time ago.
I believe that's when it was still a territory. Again, I've been trying to make the point that there is a problem on both sides. I know that there's a full court push.
Now, this is with regard to an environmental issue, correct? And is this with regard to a mine or a pipeline?
It's the pipelines again. In this case, in Michigan, the Attorney General is putting a halt to any work on the two pipelines because he feels that it is wrong.
Now, this particular article Mr. Bradley's bringing to our attention is in the Star Tribune business section of the June 28th edition, and it's talking about, again, the Michigan AG sues to shutter the pipelines. And we've reported on this before in the past, that the state's governor and attorney general believe that the pipelines that are currently in existence pose an unacceptable risk. These particular pipelines are 66 years old, and there is a plan to have Enbridge build a tunnel under the Great Lakes so that way they can put the pipes in that tunnel. But at this point, that's looking to take somewhere between 5 to 10 years or maybe even longer. And the governor of Michigan believes that the existing pipes as they are, being 66 years old, and the condition that they're in, that they pose an unacceptable risk of leakage that would have a harms and impact on the environment.
And then I did bring one other thing in, and that would happen to be because it was in the Pioneer Press this week, and it was showing the history of the Pioneer Press. It's June. It was an article or a booklet they put out from the archives, it's called. And it talks about the history of St. Paul and how the Pioneer Press interrelated with that history. In fact, it's quite interesting, and you start to realize the big city was St. Paul for so many years.
This is entitled 170 Years of the Pioneer Press. 170 years. So this is the Pioneer Press is even older than the Minneapolis School of Business that we were talking about earlier.
Right, exactly.
But you were mentioning to me that you thought that the history of the Pioneer Press actually started earlier than 170 years ago, because your grandpa worked in the newspaper business, and in his obituary it actually talked about the predecessor of the Pioneer Press, and that was called the Tribune, correct?
Exactly. So we had a Tribune in St. Paul before there was ever a Tribune in Minneapolis, which is an irony to think about. And I guess all I'm saying right now is that I have some other things to talk about, but I think we should be touching on some other things, because I think you have more information on those. I could talk about two meetings I attended.
Yes, and one of the meetings that you attended, I believe, was the last meeting of the North End Working Group, correct?
Exactly.
And how many people showed up at this last meeting?
Well, I'd say there was about 45 to 50 people. I didn't count, so I can't say specifically, but it looked around about 45 to 50, with about 70% of them being part of the city government group.
Oh, well, boy, that doesn't give you much community perspective when 75 or 71% of the people in attendance are all the governmental officials.
I've made the same statement over the last couple of weeks when we've been doing our taping of this show, that I have stated at each one of these that I would like to see somebody from the auto industry coming in, because of, as I mentioned at the last meeting, we have 5 new dealerships that are in Maplewood that were constructed in the last 5 years. And when you talk about anything to do with the auto industry, because we also have a lot of other things like paint shops and other things, we have more like 10 different units that all service cars, yet they say that that is passé, and we don't need cars in Maplewood's plan.
Right, and it should be noted that these 5 new dealerships that have entered the market in Maplewood, that they, of course, are entering in the same vicinity as where all the other current auto dealerships and used car dealerships are. And part of that is because that is the place to go. It is a destination location.
Right.
And so even though Maplewood's governmental entities, their city council and their administrators don't want to admit or acknowledge that Maplewood is a destination location when it comes to looking for an automobile, it is. And so they're keeping their head in the sand like an ostrich about this whole idea, so they want to ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. And you see, and as you pointed out, of course, that vicinity, the Highway 61 is only like a short mile or so from the Maplewood Mall area that was under study. And some of the dealerships that went in are within actually the study area,
right,
that they've ignored as well. And there you go. Let's just pretend they don't exist.
And also we got to add one other industry, which is entertainment, has also been slighted on a permit, because I've been saying also that entertainment should be notified, and there's 2 places I asked them to send invitations to, one the Doghouse and the other one the Myth.
Right, exactly. And the majority of all of the rest of our program is going to actually focus on the Myth, which is right smack dab in the middle of the North End Study area. Mr. Bradley has reported on from his meetings that he's attended as a working group member. The projected plans and maps for the Maplewood Mall area essentially have erased the Myth off the map. They don't exist, just like the dealerships don't exist. So we have a destination location for, automobiles. It doesn't exist. We're not going to acknowledge it. We have an entertainment center, the Myth, which is, certainly has had many concerts and many events at it, and many people from around the metro know of the Myth and come to Maplewood to go to the events at the Myth. Well, that is basically not acknowledged at all. And the city council, this particular city council, is doing everything they can to basically push them out of business and tell them they are not wanted in Maplewood. And so what started back this last spring has now culminated to calling the Myth before the City Council to talk about a certain safety and security plan that the council has determined that the Myth needs to have. Well, let's back up a moment, shall we? And that I believe it was back in March, there was a concert at the Myth. And in the parking lot, some rabble-rousers, they got into a tussle. Unfortunately, one of those people pulled out a gun and they shot it. Okay, somebody did get shot. They didn't die, but they did get shot. Now, yes, fighting in a parking lot is not good. Shooting a gun is even worse. However, this is not the only shooting in Maplewood.
Right.
This is not the only location where shootings have occurred in Maplewood. There's been other locations where there have been shootings that have occurred, and they've been in residential neighborhoods. They've been in commercial neighborhoods. So this is not necessarily just something that is isolated and has only happened in the parking lot of the Myth. But the point is that it isn't just limited to the Myth, and yet the Myth is being singled out.
Kind of a whipping boy.
Yes, that's right, because it's an easy thing to make a campaign platform about.
And also, I think because of after the fact, because most of the people who bought their apartments around where the Myth are actually moved in after it was there. They were aware that that was an entertainment facility.
That's right. And Mr. Bradley, you bring up a good point in that there are quite a number of housing units in and around the Maplewood Mall area near the Myth. And in the Maplewood Review a few weeks ago, they actually talked to some of those residents shortly after the shooting occurred. And while they were unhappy the shooting occurred, they were not unhappy with the Myth. So you see, they saw the distinction between the shooting that occurred by the hooligan in the parking lot and the Myth itself. So generally, they approve of the Myth. They just didn't like the shooting.
Right. And
so
I
you
do
see
live in the area, so
that's right.
I just have the same opinion. I do like the Myth. I also like the Doghouse, which I'm only a couple blocks down from, and they've been getting the same harassment, the Doghouse is. So if the Myth goes, the Doghouse will be the next one, and that's a great country rock bar that's been going on for quite a few years itself.
Right, exactly. So now we have film footage from a recent Maplewood City Council meeting where the representatives from the Myth were called in and taken to task. We also have the article from the Maplewood Review that is from June 19th with a couple of, well, choice quotes from our elected officials, which I think you'll find fascinating. But let's get started with our first clip, where the police chief of Maplewood is starting out with his introduction.
Of April 8th, the council directed me to meet with the Myth's representatives and create an action plan, otherwise known as an operational action plan, to try and mitigate some of the issues that we were experiencing at the Myth with violence, overdoses, and some other issues. We did meet 3 times. I think that the meeting stretched out over about a 2-month period because the Myth wanted to have their security representative, Mr. Stanek, do an assessment, and Mr. Stanek thought it was important to observe events that were taking place at the Myth. And so we started with the template from the Stargate because that was the direction of council, and that's kind of what we'd done in the past. And we did meet a couple of times, but we didn't make a lot of progress until that assessment came back. Once the assessment came back, I think that the was a lot of agreement and collaboration at that point on a number of different points. Most of the areas that the city or that the police department wanted to see happen, I think that we got some agreement from the MIF. And so areas of agreement, there's actually 24 items. There was one item which the representatives from the MIF wanted some time to think about, to see whether or not they thought that the idea was feasible, and they did come back to us. I think we found out today, although I think it might have come in over the weekend, that they were in agreement on the 24th item. They thought that some of the things that we wanted as expectations weren't necessarily things they were having problems with, but they didn't object to the expectation. An example of that in your operational action plan would be bottle service, where instead of buying one drink at a time, you buy a bottle of alcohol. They had stated that they hadn't had that for some time, but we wanted to make sure that that was an expectation that continued, and that if we thought it was a reasonable expectation, that we would put that in writing. We also talked in that agreement about who would be the point of contact for the MIF, and who would be the point of contact for the police department, so that we didn't have crossed wires and we had consistency. Sergeant Mike Nye, who's come in tonight, has done an excellent job, I think, of being that point of contact on the city side. Again, without having 3 or 4 different people not really knowing what the story is, we thought that that was important. There was a couple of areas of disagreement. One of the areas of disagreement were that police staff felt that with issues occurring at the MIF, but also nationwide, that installed metal detectors at larger entertainment venues were a good idea. They do have the ability to pat search, and at times they use metal wands, but we have concerns on the police side that that isn't maybe as accurate or as careful as we would want it to be. So that was one area of disagreement. The other was we talked about having a 3-drink maximum, and in discussions with the representatives from the MIF, I did agree that it did not appear as though there was a practical way to do that, because they've got so many different points of sale and so many different bartenders serving the crowd. It wasn't like they had, a waitress that could come up and kind of more effectively monitor that. And so at that point, I did withdraw that recommendation to see if these
So that is Maplewood's police chief talking about, in summary, this action plan that the city charged the MIF with putting together, and it must be approved by the police chief and by the city council. Now, Mr. Bradley, a couple of the issues that I heard there that we're going to have a clip in later on in the program that's going to address this, is that he was talking about the city was asking for a provision having to do with bottle service, where instead of buying individual drinks, you buy a bottle and then you just drink from your own bottle. Even he acknowledged that the MIF has not had that service available at all.
Right.
And yet the city is manufacturing that as a problem and requiring them to have a solution to fix it when it was never a problem. And I think that in order to get their license to sell alcohol at the MIF, they would actually have to disclose that and request to have as part of their alcohol license that they would have this ability to sell bottles. And I think under Maplewood's current ordinance, they wouldn't be able to do that anyway. So you see, it's really a red herring to make it look like they're doing something for something that is never and was never a problem. Now, the other thing that I heard him say is that they're looking at national trends and that they want to hold the MIF to a national trend, that for larger venues like this, that they have metal detectors. That's a national trend. Well, why is it, what's the justification for holding the MIF to a nationwide trend when if the plan that they've put together addresses that, and actually Chief Stanek will address that because the Myth hired Chief Stanek, who was, he was on the he was on the Minneapolis police force, had many other different positions in law enforcement, and then won election several times as the sheriff for Hennepin County. And so you see, he, of course, is the person putting together the safety plan for the Myth that they've hired as their consultant. And then the last thing that we heard about that the city of Maplewood is deciding, or was trying to push through, that the Myth could sell only 3 drinks of alcohol per patron. Are they putting that restriction on any other establishment that serves alcohol in the city of Maplewood? Because you could have the same problem at any one of those. And I would say that if Maplewood City Council thinks that there is a problem, they should pass an ordinance that affects all establishments that serve alcohol, not just pick and choose which ones they want to pick on.
Well, and a good example of that is Gulden's, which happens to be a nice restaurant that has a karaoke bar in it, which I do attend once in a while myself. And I'll say that, first of all, you cannot buy a bottle of alcohol from Gulden's either, but you can buy your drinks. And they do not have a 3-drink limit at Gulden's either. So it's the same situation there. And Doghouse or any of the others. Mm-hmm. It seems like a slippery slope at best. And it's really trying to create some type of maelstrom to throw them out.
As one of their representatives indicated during the council meeting to the council, is that the restaurants around the Myth have indicated to the Myth that they love it when there is a venue or something going on at the Myth.
Right.
Because as a result, people who are going to that as a destination, that they maybe come early so that they can eat out first and then go to their concert, or they go to the concert and then they go out afterwards and they eat out afterwards. And so it's a really big plus for many of the other businesses around that Maplewood Mall area. And again, why they would have been basically shunned from the North End working group and planning for the North End of Maplewood near the Maplewood Mall is astounding.
Right.
It's very myopic. Well, let's continue with our next clip.
Pulled up for the council. We are here tonight because at the city council meeting of April 8th.
Okay, we gotta go to the
Council
next one.
On recommendation number 22, have they agreed to that?
Members of the council, that is the one issue that they said they wanted some extra time to think about. Over the weekend, they did contact their liaison, Sergeant Nye, and they said that after consideration, they were agreeing to that. 1.5 ounces of alcohol is the national standard. Our concern, obviously, is that some probably pour about that amount where others could pour more generously. It's a pretty busy, I would imagine, environment, and there's lots of things happening and people there. And so they did ask for 30 days for trying to figure out a way to implement that, whether it's kind of the top of a bottle type of measurement system, or your kind of old school metal jigger, or however they're going to end up doing that. And I think that's certainly a reasonable request, but they did agree to that.
In essence, what Councilmember Kathleen Juniman is asking about when she's talking about number 22 on the list is that's a requirement as to how much alcohol the business can put in a drink, so that they have to measure that it is below a certain amount that is going to be required for them in how they mix their drinks. Now, I know from my experience, most places do not want to have their their drink mixing go overboard on the amount of alcohol that they put in, because it means that they are affecting their bottom line. So they want to actually walk that fine line between the amount of alcohol that somebody's hoping they're going to get in their drink
Right.
and the amount that the business can get away with. That's the minimum amount that they can get by with, that they're still giving the value that somebody felt they paid for. And here we have the city of Maplewood weighing in on it and saying what they think the amount of alcohol should be in that drink. So now we've got the city council all being the bartenders at the Myth. They're all going to go there, and maybe they should just go and get a job there as a bartender. Now, Kathleen Juniman, she of course wants to put on the persona that she is this cranky old woman who has nothing good to say about drinking, alcohol, having fun, attorneys, or whatever. She's the just say no kind of a person. But she is so much that way that she is very arrogant and very out front about how she feels about these things, including attorneys. In the paper, there's a quote from her that where she said that communication between the council and the venue located off of County Road D near Maplewood Mall could improve, a point that both sides agree. She then added it would be better in the future to do it without attorneys getting involved. You know, our communication with you would be better if your attorneys didn't get involved. And then this is her quote. Quote, "To be blunt, stay away next time," she said to the Myth's attorneys. The Myth's attorneys said, "Pardon? Wow. What council person do you know who would look at somebody who needed legal representation and tell them next time, don't bring your attorneys?" Well, I'm going to give you a little story, couple little stories. Here's part of the reason why council member Kathleen Juniman doesn't like attorneys, because they can see right through her. Now, there was a case a few years back where the city was going to use their power inappropriately to put a harassment restraining order on somebody who was expressing their viewpoint about the city council. And of course, that person took it to court to contest that restraining order that was being put against him. And one of the people that claimed that they needed protection from this guy was none other than council member Kathleen Juniman. When she was up on the stand, she made it sound and implied in her testimony to the judge that after council meetings, she now needed to have somebody drive her home at night after the meetings, implying it was because she was fearful of this gentleman who might be there at the meetings. However, the attorney that was cross-examining her knew that she couldn't see in the dark and couldn't drive at night, and asked her about that, in which she had to reply, yes, she had always had somebody drive her home at the end of council meetings, and yes, it was true. She couldn't see in the dark and wasn't able to drive at home at night herself. And no, it wasn't really because of that gentleman. So you see, there's an example where an attorney, knowing that she was not telling the truth, got her to actually confess that she wasn't telling the truth. In another case where she had to testify, again where the city was trying to use its power inappropriately to get a restraining order against a different resident who they didn't like what he had to say. She was a key witness, testifying to all kinds of things that this gentleman did and how she felt, and yet that gentleman showed a video film footage of the very incident that she was complaining about, and you could see very clearly that she had a way to exit, that she was smiling and grinning, and that clearly it was not the way that she portrayed it to the judge. And in that particular order, the judge clearly said and stated in the order that council member Kathleen Juniman's testimony was not credible. Not credible. So again, in another court of law, a different year, a different circumstance, again, she was found to be not credible, and so it's no wonder that Ms. Kathleen Juniman wants everybody to operate without attorneys, because she thinks that she can hoodwink everybody else if they don't have an attorney. So don't bring them next time, because she doesn't like them.
You know, the one thing I have to think about here is, where would Kathleen Juniman, if she sets these specific regulations on measurement, who's going to do it? Is it going to be our police force, or are we going to have to get the people who check our gas in our tanks?
Oh, you mean for the amount of alcohol in a drink?
Right.
Yes, how are they going to measure
weights
that?
and measures, you know, having them, federal or state institution come to there to verify that they are specifically staying down the right. And who writes the ticket and for how much?
Well, what they'll do is they'll send in one of their compliance officers, who will then be there with their little alcohol measurement doohickey, and then they'll write them up a secret ticket. So let's take a look at our next clip.
Glad you mentioned the music genre, and not just having painting a broad brush with particular kinds of genres in particular when we're talking about rap music. I've had citizens say to me, well, if they just didn't have those rap groups there, everything would be fine. And I just don't want people to think that when you put the label of rap on something, that it just means it's all bad. I'm going to show my rap knowledge now. When you talk about, I mean, you could talk about Jay-Z, you could talk about Common, you could talk about Chance the Rapper. All those are not what you would call horrible rap groups. But I think that the things that are in place in this agreement, if they're followed, should cut down on a lot, if not all, of the things that have happened in the past. Were there any incidents reported at this last event?
Mayor, members of the council, there was some issues of intoxication, I think.
Okay, so there was some issues of intoxication. Well, you know, they probably had a few issues of intoxication at a few other bars around the city of Maplewood. I would imagine they've had a few calls to, well, there's one off of White Bear Avenue, not far from City Hall, that I'm sure has had a few calls for people being drunken and disorderly. I think so. You know, I think it happens when you're serving alcohol. Some people just don't know when is enough.
Exactly.
But is it the, you know, is that what we're going to hold them accountable to?
And
that they have to have a different standard than everybody else in town?
And when you're taking a look at it, think of all the restaurants that are there, like Red Lobster, Outback Steakhouse, the Olive Garden. They all serve alcohol.
Right.
And if somebody is acting up, it's the person who exceeded what he should have been drinking. That's the problem, not them. And
Right,
most of the time, they don't want him around either, because it causes them problem if he starts to get rowdy.
Well, and that is very true, Mr. Bradley. And you bring up another point as a side issue, is that there is no knowing how many drinks somebody has had before they go to the Myth.
Right.
Because they could have gone to one of those restaurants that also serve alcohol, and they could have had 2 or 3 drinks there, and then went to the Myth and had another couple drinks. So you see this idea that we're only going to allow somebody to have 3 drinks and that's somehow going to solve the problem. It doesn't mean that they didn't already have 3 drinks before they got there. Doesn't mean that they didn't have a bottle of alcohol in their car before they got there. There's all kinds of unmeasurable type of circumstances that now suddenly you're be holding the Myth accountable for.
Right.
So let's continue with our next clip.
The concerns I have here is essentially we're managing their business for them. every item on here, should be attended to by a good business manager if you're in this business. And so I'm concerned and want to hear from these owners, gentlemen, operators, and so forth, and security people, what's going to happen down the road to make sure that this business is operated the way it should be. So it's a comment, and I guess the ultimate question is are we going to continue to put out this agenda, which is essentially managing their business?
Councilmember Juniman.
I have a question on the first one that there was disagreement about.
Now, that is Council Member Knutson, who was just newly appointed to the council. And he brings up a good point. So is the city of Maplewood now in the business of managing the business of the myth? And do they have that ability and authority to do that? Or should they? The person who spoke in the clip before that was newly appointed city council member Sylvia Neblett. Well, of course, she also seemed a little more conciliatory towards the business. So you can see they have a different attitude than the majority of the council, who have been really trying to boot the myth out of Maplewood for the past 5 years. And the new council members, they're really there to go along and to vote the way the rest of the council tells them to. But in this case, they've actually stepped out of bounds a little bit by trying to ask a question or two that make it seem that they're a little more conciliatory towards the business. So let's take a look at the next clip to see where we go from there.
Contract security versus directly employed security and the vetting of those vendors. Are we confident that security personnel are direct employees and will remain direct employees? And regardless, do we have any guidelines in here as far as their hiring process for direct security, as well as any requirements if they do contract security as far as having bonded licensed security providers at that time?
Mayor and members of the council, that was a question that we talked about. We talked about training requirements for security. We talked about training requirements for people that were in the alcohol service side of it. We asked for a detailed training plan for security. They'd given us kind of the plan they were using, and that's one of the areas I think that we had said that we could beef up a little bit in writing as far as the training plan for their security. My understanding, and again, this is something certainly the Myth could talk to, is that most of the security that work at Myth actually work for Myth. And we did have a conversation about if they needed to expand to a private contractor, that they have to be licensed in the state of Minnesota.
The council member speaking was Council Member Brian Smith. Now his concern, the concern of Council Member Knutson just went right out the window when it came to Brian Smith, because he doesn't care whether or not if he's going to meddle in the Myth's business or not. He's worrying about how are we going to go through that process of hiring people. Do we need to tell them how to hire people? Do we need to make sure that their security people are actually on staff with the Myth versus hiring a reputable security company that's in charge of all of that training and whatever?
Right.
You see the difference is that you've got Mr. Smith there being the micromanager and saying how he's going to run the business from the council dais. And he doesn't give a rip about whether or not if he's running the business or not, because he's got the power and authority. He can tell them how to do it. So let's continue.
Know that there are representatives from the Myth here. Would you please step to the podium and give us your name and your title? Welcome to the council.
Thank you for having me. My name is Bill Skolnick. I'm an attorney with Skolnick and Joyce. I've had the opportunity to meet with the chief and Sergeant Nye and other members. I'm here to tell you that the Myth has taken tremendous steps to improve the issues that are being discussed. However, I wanted to tell you about where I think things can be improved, and that's in terms of communication. I respect Mr. Knutson, Councilmember Knutsen's comments about, I don't think you want to run our business, my client's business. My client doesn't want you to run their business. That's not the appropriate roles. At one time, I think there were 38 items we were discussing. I said to the chief, by making this look this way, it's like saying you need to do these 38 things. The Myth was already doing 34 of them. 3 of them didn't apply. We haven't had bottle service in years. So to be concerned about bottle service was one of those issues like, it sounds like it's a problem, but actually there is.
So this attorney is bringing up that particular issue that we spoke about earlier, in that the laundry list of all these things that the Myth has to do in order to get their gold star, well, 34 of the 38 things they were already doing. 3 things didn't even apply whatsoever, and all it is just a way to have a platform in which they can howl to the moon to. Well, let's continue as the attorney continues with his comments.
I do appreciate the security director, director of safety for the city meeting with us, his staff. And I do tell you, we take things very seriously. In fact, we hired an expert in the area, former Hennepin County Sheriff Rich Stanek, who's with us, who prepared a detailed report, which I'll have my partner, Mr. Bardwell. It's been already provided to.
We've already been provided the report.
You have?
And we've already read it.
Okay, great. And he's here to answer any questions of what he observed as a professional. So I am telling you that this is really more of you wanted the police chief to make sure that the Myth was doing what it needed to do to protect the safety of its patrons, and they are. There are a couple of problems with the approach. This is not the Stargate. This is not a nightclub. It's an event center. It's open 50 to 90 days a year. That's all. They're open from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m., and the building's emptied. So it's not the typical bar nightclub that the Stargate plan was envisioned. We've never had a citation for underage drinking, service of an underage patron. So there are a lot of issues that sound like they're problems, but they're problems in theory. In practice, the Myth has a top-notch security chief, Kirby, who's with us tonight, and he's here to answer questions. The staff, the bartending staff, the security staff have been trained and are doing a really good job. And I don't ask you to take my word for it. We've had Sheriff Stanek, Mr. Stanek, come and observe a number of concerts, from country to hip-hop to you name the genre, to observe what it's like to have between 1,000 to 2,500 people coming through the doors and making sure there's order, fun, and enjoyment, and not.
The attorney gives a very good snapshot of how the Myth as an entertainment center is different than a bar or a nightclub, in that they're only open 50 to 70 times a year for events. And those events, they have 1,000 to 2,500 people in attendance. And that during all of that time, they have never been cited as violating underage serving. And so here we have the attorney clearly showing why the plan that the city was attempting to take from the Stargate nightclub on Rice Street and take that and just translate it to that of the Myth why it doesn't necessarily work. Let's continue.
Comment about Ms. Juniman's question about the access to the security tapes?
No, that wasn't my question.
Well, actually, let me address it this way. They've been available within 24 hours. Absolutely. We want to provide that to the community, to the law enforcement, and we do. Never rejected a request, ever. So, like I said, there are things that might sound like there's a problem because you're suggesting something. The fact is they're being done. With that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bardwell, if he had any comments. If not, I'd like to have Mr. Stanek, if he would like to come and be available to answer any of your questions.
Thank you.
Now, we didn't show the clip, but during the meeting, Kathleen Juniman had a compound question. And her compound question did include the issue about security tapes, because one of those 34 items that were listed in this wish list of things they wanted the MITH to comply with is that if there was an incident, that the MITH would provide the security tapes of that incident or that night within 24 hours of the incident or the request for the tape. And so that, of course, implies that there has been requests for these tapes in the past and that the MITH has not complied and that they've withheld the tapes and somehow not cooperated, when in fact, there's no proof of that. That's never happened. The other question had to do with a different issue, and let's continue with our clip.
Councilmember Juniman, well, why don't we wait and we can ask questions
Well,
all at
he
once.
misidentified my question.
Councilmember Juniman, go
Thank
ahead.
you. My question had to do with the disagreement over metal detectors.
Yes, in fact, you had more than one question, and one of them was about metal detectors. And the issue about metal detectors is a question of cost, and there's a corollary issue that isn't related to cost. Right now, we pat and search everyone that comes in. Getting 1,000 to 2,500 people through 4 or 5 doors, it's a question of timing, it's a question of efficacy. Are the security, the walk-through security monitors what you're looking for? We do have the hand wands.
I know.
And the question is, are they really that effective? As you know, at the airports, they have them. People get through with things. I think everyone will acknowledge they're not.
So the other part of Kathleen Juniman's compound question had to do with metal detectors, and that she wants to add on that cost to the overhead of what the MITH is already doing. And yet, yes, are the metal detectors, is that a point of diminishing returns? That's what the business question is. And that is also the other question of how much more effective are they than using the wands and the pat down that the business is already using. Now, it's my understanding that the incidences that have been complained about didn't occur inside the MITH after the security efforts were undertaken, that they happened out in the parking lot before the wanding and the pat downs occurred. So they also talk about when and how the security efforts really start as part of their plan. But let's continue with our next clip as we move along through the discussion.
About 8 weeks ago, I was contacted, asked to take a look at this issue at the MITH and see what I thought in terms of risk management, overall security. I can tell you over the last 8 weeks, I attended 4 different events. I had a chance to meet with Chief Nadeau and his staff several times, and I've met certainly quite a bit with MITH management. I think overall, they do a pretty good job. And I say that from the perspective of 35 years of policing experience, both as a state legislator, a Minneapolis police officer, the sheriff of a large county, and a former commissioner of public safety. So I've got a broad base of experience by which to draw on. And when I took a look at the myth, I looked at some of the easy things, some of the things that were identified in Chief Nadeau's OAC back to the myth. And I think at the end of the day, there were 34 items that we took a look at. 32 of the items right off the bat were either done, already in process, or several were deleted because they just weren't applicable. But it really comes down to these last two. One, the 1.5 ounce pour standard, which you just addressed. And secondly, now you're having some discussion, council members and mayor, about magnetometers. That's what we call them. And there are several ways to look at this, quite honestly. Based on my experience, I think the myth does a good job with their security. There are no less than 3 different levels of security to get into the myth to begin with. The first starts in the parking lot. They have staff, security staff, that are well marked with high visibility green shirts, as the chief noted and pointed out. They screen people while they're waiting in line before they ever get into the building or into the...
Now, Mr. Stanek indicated that before working on the recommendations and working on the progress plan, that he went to a number of concerts of different types of music to observe what the current policies and procedures and protocols are, so he could identify if and how they could be improved, and then look at that compared to what Maplewood was suggesting. I think that that seems to make very logical and practical sense in the whole matter of putting together a safety and security plan, as the Maplewood City Council is so intent upon. So let's continue with our next clip.
Staff. They had 2 when I started there. They now have 3 per show. Those EMTs are looking for signs of intoxication. They're looking for signs of impairment, and that's what you would expect. Try and prevent it ever from beginning. Secondly, then they enter that first set of doors. There's a double set of doors. They enter that first set of doors, and they are hand pat searched. Everybody who comes in, without exception. There is no re-entry, so once you go into the building, you don't get a chance to leave. If you're escorted out because of misconduct or something that happens, you get big black X's on the top of your hands, and everybody knows there's no re-entry. I saw several people try very hard re-entry, thought that they, whatever it might be. Staff has been very firm with them. I think the pat searching does what it's supposed to do. I wasn't there this last Friday night. I understand what Chief Nadeau said about a gentleman that came back out of the front doors and removed a 175-liter bottle of alcohol. I don't know that a metal or magnetometer would have detected that. That is not what those are for, and that's part of the problem here. When you have a hand or a pat search, it is direct face-to-face contact. Ma'am, I need you to open your purse. I need you to open your bag. Sir, I need you to unzip your jacket. You take a look. You do that pat search. I venture to say this gentleman was intimidated, went back out. The staff allows him to do so and discard whatever they're not supposed to be bringing in to begin with. That includes alcohol. That includes weapons. That includes anything else. That's doing the job. Magnetometers are not the end-all, be-all, but that's for myth management, as I laid out to them to discuss. The cost of each one of those is about $8,500 to $12,000 for a quality one. You would have to have no less than 3 because they operate 2 points of entry, meaning 2 lines.
On the Maplewood slide, we saw that they estimated that the cost of a metal detector would be a sum total of $4,000 to $5,000 each. And of course, we heard Mr. Stanek say that if you want a quality one that is even going to get close to doing the job that you're expecting us to do, it would be $12,000 a piece. So quite a difference between what Maplewood thinks the costs and what the reality would be for the type of metal detector that would be required. So let's continue with our next clip.
I've also had a chance one-on-one to talk with moms and grandparents, adults, and some of the youth that attend the all-age events. And you know, if you had a chance to read the report I provided, it talks about a mom from Wayzata who dropped off her two teenage daughters and one friend at a concert venue, and then while the kids were at the concert, she went out, had dinner, ended up at a Caribou down the road, and then the kids called, came back and picked up. And I talked with her about why would, if these are the issues that have been articulated over the last 8 weeks before the council, the issues of crime or disorderly conduct occurring at the Myth, why would mom from Wayzata want to leave her 3 teenage daughters in an environment like that? But that's not what she said. She enjoys the Myth. Her kids enjoy the Myth. I meant this to be a family-friendly event for the most part. I think, you know, you talk about some of the different genres of music. What would maybe be hip-hop seem to be less problems than maybe some of the country concerts that I saw, the 2 of them I attended. And mainly because they're more adults. It's not about the young people, it's more about the adults. But overall, I think the Myth does a fairly nice job. I'm happy to take any questions about what I saw, what I observed.
He indicated, didn't he, Mr. Bradley, that this mother and the 3 teenagers, they came from Wayzata
Right.
to go to an event that was specifically for teenagers.
Right.
And the mother felt comfortable with bringing them there, and while she was waiting for them, she had a place to go while she was waiting. She went to a Maplewood restaurant. Wow, and after that, she went to the Maplewood Caribou. So she actually spent discretionary income at 2 different Maplewood Mall places, and the teenagers had their purchases, their tickets and whatever, beverages or whatever, at the Myth.
Right.
So you see, it goes right to the heart of what you've been saying all along, is that the Myth, by being a destination location, it is also something that brings people to Maplewood Mall area, so it can be a destination location.
Right, and my son actually has gone to this location because they had a concert about a year and a half ago with Lindsey Sterling, which is a very accomplished violinist. And I had no worries about it. He had a great time there, and he thought it was wonderful that it was in his own neighborhood.
Yes,
It was
exactly.
exciting.
That's good. Now we have our last clip, which goes to that very issue of communication, where it shows clearly that Maplewood has put the Myth on the shunning list. And by doing so, that means they're not going to communicate with the Myth. So much so that they don't even have their police officers patrol by the Myth when there's a concert going on. Let's take a look.
Be able to help bridge the gap in terms of these communications, because really at the end of the day, when I first walked in, that was very noticeable from minute one, is that there seems to be some point where communications literally came to a stop. The 4 events that I attended, I did not see a Maplewood police car, squad car stop by. I saw Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, I saw Minnesota State Patrol, and we had discussions about that. This last Friday night, I understand Maplewood Police did stop by. They did a walk through the venue. That's the partnership that the police department and the business community need to have with each other, and I hope that'll continue. I hope that was inspiring to as a point moving forward, that will continue. It'll keep both sides in terms of brokering a relationship so they can operate their business while at the same time providing for public safety of both the staff and the residents, neighborhood, and others who attend the
So there you go. Very clear, very evident. The city hall up at Maplewood was clearly telling their police officers, do not go to the Myth when there's a concert, because if they have a problem, just let it happen. Because if it happens, then it'll give us some ammunition so we can do something to move them on out. Why provide the public safety and the public service that they should provide to all businesses in Maplewood?
And the point I look at is by having the police patrol beforehand and sweep through, during, they could alleviate some of these issues, but instead they've been trying to take it the other way.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.